Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 26th of March 2024. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on tonight. And this is going to be a really important show. A lot, of course, to do with housing and related issues. And we'll get into some of the deep and dirty secrets behind what's happening to housing. And we'll touch on things like, well, is the housing market broken or is it behaving precisely as you'd expect given all the inputs? Just before I bring Cameron in, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific financial legal advice on the channel. We do moderate the chat, but encourage you to throw your questions and comments in. I won't necessarily follow every thread, but if you want to ask a specific question or get my attention, use @WalkTheWorld. That'll make sure that I see it. It goes into my separate queue. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question to the top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. Right, let me bring Cameron straight in because there's so much to talk about. Cameron, welcome.
Hi, Martin. Thanks for having me back.
I really appreciate it. And boy, you've been a busy. Q&A on the ABC last night, Q&A on DFA tonight.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I got a book to sell. So no point writing a book no one reads. So you got to get on the promo circuit. But it's been actually very interesting to meet a lot of people and talk about the issues. And hopefully I get a break next week for Easter though.
Yeah. So the book's been out a little while. It's got a lot of coverage, a lot of it good, a lot of it also, I think, interesting cross currents. And of course, we might touch a bit later on the conversation book review from Brendan Coates from Grattan Institute, which was interesting. And I also have to say that you've upset a number of planners who actually believe that the solution, of course, is just to change the planning rules and regulations, and everything will be solved. So we might touch on that too.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, where should we start?
Well, let's start with a little bit of history because you put out an interesting commentary a little while ago showing that you'd been starting to talk about some of the housing issues quite a few years ago. And so people shouldn't be surprised that there's a housing problem, if there is a problem, because the seeds for this have been running for quite some time. In fact, I remember I did my first ABC news interview in 2001. And I was talking then, because I just started the surveys, about the fact that we were beginning to lay some traps for the housing sector that could actually really morph into something quite difficult ahead, and talked specifically about things like first-time buyers, what have you. Now, you were also making some interesting comments. So I guess my question is, how do we get to where we got to?
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. I think you and I both have had 20 years talking about housing in Australia. And so the idea that today in 2024, there's all of a sudden a crisis is a little bit strange if we look at the essentially yearly political inquiries into housing. I remember there was the 2003 First Homeowners Task Force. There were numerous other ones in the 2000s boom. We had a Housing Supply Council that operated from 2008 to 2018, and they had many, many reports. So it's not exactly a new thing. And actually, I like to share an anecdote, a quote from when a celebrity visited Sydney. It's my favorite one because it provides that context that we miss in the housing debate. The quote is this. This is what a famous visitor to Sydney wrote in their diary. The number of large houses just finished and others building is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house. Sydney has a population of 23,000 and is rapidly increasing. 23,000? Yeah, that was Charles Darwin in 1836, his first day in Sydney. He's traveling the world on the HMS Beagle, coming up with the theory of evolution, watching the animals and the human animals he observes in Sydney. And he says, what do human animals in Sydney do? Well, they complain about housing. And so I think, zooming out and taking this big perspective really, really helps us think about, okay, what does the market deliver with housing? What should I expect from a housing market? We can fast forward from the 1836 to 1911. New South Wales had its first inquiry into the rapid rising rents in Sydney in 1911, which led to the first Fair Rents Act of 1915. But then there was another federal inquiry in 1919, the Piddington Review that I wrote about at Fresh Economic Thinking on last weekend. And that review, it could have been written today. Same subject matter, same discussions. I could cut and paste it and publish it, and the press would love it. And then we can fast forward to the 2000s and all the reports. And so I don't think we should be surprised, actually. I think that's the big lesson for me. If we look historically, property always goes in cycles, and every different parts of the cycle have how would we call it? Disruptive adjustment periods. I think, and that's what we're living through right now, a disruptive part of the cycle, but one that happens periodically and has happened for 200 years. And it's not due to a sudden change in town planning or a sudden change in this or that. It's a natural outcome of the cycle. So I think, we shouldn't be surprised. And if we'd been paying attention since the early 2000s, we would have seen the 2000s cycle. We would have seen the 2010s construction cycle. We would have noticed all these things. So, anyway, I'm definitely with you, Martin, on that one.
Right. So it's a long-term trend, and it's something which has effectively gotten to where we've got to, over a long period of time. And through that period, we know that there have been significant power alignment between, for example, the developers and the government and the financial system and the government and, all of those things. We also know that planning rules and regulations have sort of morphed and changed and all of those things. But I guess if you sort of stand back, my next question then is, so is the market behaving as a market would behave given all the inputs that we know about? Because quite often people say, and I've been known to say it too, well, the property market's broken. Well, maybe the market isn't actually broken. Maybe it's behaving quite rationally given all of the inputs. The problem is some of the inputs could be irrational.
Yeah, I think I take your point there. I think you're right. That's sort of where I get to in the book, is that the market's not broken. The periods in history where we had great housing outcomes were not because the market did them. We did other things. We had rent controls, we had public housing options, we had major interventions, but we've sort of shifted the debate now where we think the market is going to deliver all that. The market's going to deliver equality. So poor people can live in rich suburbs. The market is going to do this. No. That's not what the market's going to do. We got favorable outcomes on those terms, having poor people live on Sydney Harbour, for example, by building them public housing on Sydney Harbour. And then we often sold it to them, or these rent-to-buy schemes. And that's how we got better housing outcomes. So if we look, for example, at home ownership in Australia in the cities prior to the Second World War, it was in the low 40%. And then by 1971, it was 71.6 according to the census, but there's error there. So we got around a quarter of all households out of renting and subject to all those cycles and going through the 1911 and the 1919 cycle. And we got them into home ownership, and there was a generation there that benefited from that stability. Then we sort of changed our mind and said, oh, well, we've got lots of homeowners now. We'll stop that and we'll just let the market work again. And I think one of the issues with that approach is, as you say, we sort of encourage lots of finance into housing because we want the market to fix housing for us. And if you look back at the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s, one of the conversations was, oh, people can't get into housing because they can't borrow money. So we've got to let banks lend lots more money, get single people to borrow money, all these things. And so now we really have sort of reversed that post-war trend. And so we've got banks lending, in the 2000s boom and before the Royal Commission, no deposit mortgages. And so everybody's now tied into the market situation the way it is. Developers like it, the banks like it, landlords like it, everyone enjoying the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. They're all, we're all now embedded in this market system. And that's why I think change is so difficult. And that's why the book's called The Great Housing Hijack. Whoops, I've got stuff in, everyone go and find that online. The debate's also hijacked because there are now so many interest groups with their, snout at the trough of the housing market. So it makes it very hard to change. So anyway, that's the sort of story I get to after looking at the broad sweep of history. We now are having this weird debate of how do we get the market to work better? How do we get the market to work better? And maybe I'll just read a little something for you just to show how hijacked or off course I think the debate is. When I asked all my Twitter followers last year, what's wrong with housing today? Let me just show you what they said. Some people said there's too much density in the suburbs. Some said there's not enough density in the suburbs. Some said we must tax property more. Some said there's too many taxes on property. Some people said there's too many investor buyers outbidding homeowners, and others said there's too few investor buyers for the rental market. Some said we need tiny homes. Some said we need better homes. Some said interest rates are too high. Some said interest rates are too low. Some said banks are too restrictive with lending. Some said banks are too loose with lending. We don't know what to expect from the market, right? Everybody just thinks, oh, change something, and then the market will solve our problems for us. But, people go, there's a housing crisis, and they'll all agree and they'll nod, and then you'll ask them in private, so do we need lower or higher interest rates? And they'll give you opposite answers. And I think we need to get into those deeper questions about what the market does and what can lower or higher interest rates do for the housing market. We know lower interest rates will raise prices, but will they change the composition of buyers as well? These are the tricky questions that I try to address in detail in the book. But yeah, that's how I see the story that you sort of mentioned about market outcomes and the interest, the irrational inputs into the market. I don't know if it's irrational. I think it's just everybody likes things the way they are because there's banks getting a cut from having lots of mortgages on houses, developers getting a cut from, high immigration and other stimulus measures. So we like it like it.
And you can see that from the debate. I mean, it's fascinating. I've been following the Greens, for example. I know they were also on Q&A yesterday. And the Greens are saying two interesting things. One is migration isn't the problem. Two, if we create a public body that can actually build more, we'll talk about whether that's feasible or not, then we can solve the problem. So they've got a particular set of strategies. So let's pull that apart a little bit. Is migration part of the problem? And, there are many people who say, well, we've actually got way more people coming into the country than ever before. So therefore, from a supply and demand point, that's clearly an issue.
Yeah, look, immigration is one of those topics where it's very hard to get into the detail. So this is probably the best forum to do it. So why don't we try? I like to put it this way. If I went back in time to 1924, when there were 6 million people, and told them there'd be 26 or 27 million in a century's time, they might be shocked. They would say, oh, that's too many people, house prices would never be cheap, blah, 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 blah. But, it was totally fine. There are many cheap periods in the 2000 cycle and in the 2010 cycle. There were cheap periods, relatively speaking, cheaper than in the 1920s. But it's not how far we get or how far we grow. It's the speed along the way, those periods of rapid growth that are very disruptive and do lead to rising rents. And we're in one right now. And we had one in 2006 to 2009. John Howard really opened up the work visas and student visas. And we went from about 100,000 to 300,000 per year net immigration in a couple of years. And rents increased, and it took until the second half of the 2010s for rents to start falling. We actually, if you look at a chart of real rents, you'll see from 2007 to 2015, basically, it was this massive rise and then a big fall for 5 years after that. So 2017 to 2022, rents pretty much fell everywhere in the country. So that's, it takes a while for markets to adjust. And I like the analogy of driving, right? It's not how far you go that's a problem, it's the speed at which you go where the risks are. And just because we had low immigration during COVID doesn't mean we can speed now and there's no risk, right? Just like if I got stuck in traffic, I don't get to speed to catch up because I was going slow back then. It's still risky. That's how we should think about population growth. We should think about it as high speeds are risky because markets don't adjust that quickly to having more people. And if you look back in time to period, people go, oh, but it's not that rapid, right? We had periods of high population growth in the 70s and the 60s and all these things. If you go and read in the archives, the newspapers at the time, they're saying, oh, we're building all these new housing estates with unsealed roads, no drainage, no schools, kids are doing school under the trees, there's no sewers, we can't keep up with it. And then we have population growth comes down, then we catch up, right? So it's definitely a tricky adjustment, and I'm very puzzled by the fact that post-COVID, the UK, Canada, Australia, everyone seems to have adopted this very generous open borders type immigration program. And it's not clear to me why exactly. But yeah, there's definitely an effect. And to think about how markets adjust to that, everybody who arrives has to squeeze through this narrow doorway of the rental market. And in the rental market each month, it's actually lower today than usually, but about 50,000 to 90,000 dwellings come up for rent. So we have 50,000 or 90,000 households relocate, and everybody trying to fit back into another property in the rental market. If we have 50,000 immigrants a month, right? We need another, say, we need another 20,000 households to squeeze in that narrow doorway with the existing 50,000 households and fit into those homes, because you can't just go into any home. There's 11 million homes, but you can't just split your family up and every 20th home on the street, put one kid in one and spread them out. Okay, we have to go through this narrow doorway. And so if you think about the rental price adjustment that's happened since COVID, we've had lots of inflation, and incomes have risen. We get this rising rental price. But on top of that, layered on top of that, is a blip for the immigration as well. Now, that blip will smooth out in the next 5-6 years. We will have another construction boom. People will reorganize their households, right? People will stay at home longer. The grandparents will live with their kids. They'll get rid of their holiday house. It doesn't take a huge amount of that to happen for everyone to smooth out again. But yeah, there's a big temporary effect. And the other thing we miss is there's just a huge resource cost to duplicating the roads, the sewers, the water supplies, and the buildings just to accommodate extra people who we know after the first 50 to 100,000 aren't changing the age composition of the country in the future. If you look at the annual immigration rate across here and its effect on the age distribution here, we have a high effect for the first 50,000, a tiny effect for the next 50,000, and then after that, there's essentially no change because all these people also get older. And so it's not clear to me what we're achieving by this. And I do find it very hypocritical for the major parties, for example, in Q&A yesterday, to sit there and go, it's a supply issue, it's a supply issue, it's a supply issue. So they've got this very naive model of number of people, number of new homes being built, right? And they're saying, no, it's not this, it's this. And I'm like, well, we've never built enough homes for that many people. And you can easily just lower this by tightening up entry requirements for universities and work visas. Super easy, right? But for some reason, we only want to talk about that. Now, I have a more subtle view of how population affects the market, but if you're going to sprout the basic quantity of people, quantity of new dwelling story, you can't just pick one side. I think that's kind of ridiculous. And I didn't realize how much of a taboo that topic was until last night. The major parties, especially the Labor Party, just do not want to talk about it. It's untouchable. They don't know what to say in public about it, so they say nothing and carry on. And I think there's a huge political opportunity elsewhere for people to jump on that with very moderate and sensible views about increasing standards in all the visa categories, or especially the students and work categories, and bringing that number back down by 50, more than 50% in the second half of this year and next year. So
Well,
anyway, sorry, I'm going on.
No. But I've got a theory. The reason that they want the high migration is because the overall economic story is not particularly strong at the moment, and GDP per capita is going backwards. But if you bring enough people in, the top line GDP number will still stay positive. So if you are actually driving your policies around trying to maintain a positive GDP, then from their perspective, anybody coming into the country is good, because a bigger number means you actually create more activity, which gives you a bigger GDP. Now, I don't think GDP is the right measure for measuring anything, but I think that's part of the story.
I suspect you're right, and it still puzzles me. So if we take that as our sort of primary explanation of this, we can look at Canada and we can see they've had 1 million extra immigrants this year. And there's just fierce political pushback there now. So I don't understand the political trade-off between, get a bigger headline GDP. Great. No one cares about it. No one in the street knows what the GDP is, right? I don't know how many swing voters do. So, but yeah, I get that it's a good headline and all that. So great. And it sort of justifies a lot of public investment, which I don't know if you need to justify, but whatever. But then there's this trade-off of this pushback.
Brings more tax. It brings more tax.
Yeah, it does, but it comes with huge costs, right? Like the duplication at the state level is just now such a source of frustration. The state saying, well, you've hammered us with this open borders. Now we have to duplicate all this stuff. Now we have to deal with this. Now we need an underground train here. Now we needed this. So I don't get, you're picking all those political fights and taking all that risk that people will have a backlash, an electoral backlash, for a headline number that no one reads. And like maybe politics is that weird or that silly or that superficial, and maybe utopia is more accurate than we think, the ABC TV show. But then I think about it deep down, and I'm wondering, surely someone behind closed doors mentions the trade-off. And surely someone in the minor parties or the LNP or the Nationals and anyone saying, hey, we can get a free win if we can align ourselves together on this and pitch this as a cost of living fairness issue to moderate from the extreme level back to something pre-John Howard or even more. So 100,000 to 150,000. I mean, whatever number you get is going to vary over the cycle as well. But if you tighten up the rules, you get into that band. I just see a huge win there because the major parties don't know how to respond, and especially the Labor Party. But then again, I never got elected. I ran for politics twice, and maybe I know nothing.
So I've had the view for some time that the migration story is definitely part of the issue. And if you look at the mix of people coming in, it's interesting to note that quite a few people who are coming at the moment have a lot of cash. So they're coming in from India, they're coming in from Asia, as well as from Europe. And quite a few of them are actually quite quickly going into purchase property. And so they're able to purchase property because they've actually got assets available to be able to actually buy. And so that's definitely part of the issue. In addition, of course, we also know that there's a high student count, and the universities, of course, have been pushing very hard to maintain big input to the student sector. And of course, and I know that the way that the GDP is calculated vis-a-vis students is a bit reversed, really. So actually, all those education budgets are actually seen as positive to GDP, when actually maybe that's not quite the case either. So there's a lot of students, and so the question is, Do you turn the dial back on students? And the Labour said that they were going to do that, although actually the data suggests that hasn't really happened. Other point, if you look at it, and the data came out yesterday from the ABS, if you take away the migration and look at the interstate migration, in fact, population in Sydney will be going backwards.
Yeah, but it's not independent of the arrivals internationally, right?
No.
So the departure of Sydney local residents into other cities is a process of what economists call spatial equilibrium, and that gets a chapter in the book. So essentially it says that because you can relocate, because you can trade locations of where you live, people will move and quality of life will equalize amongst location. And so if Sydney's attracting, as you say, wealthy home buying immigrants, making rents difficult because of all these extra students in those key suburbs where the universities are, and then extra buyers, people just won't move there, or they'll move away. And so they'll sort of make space for those. The two are not independent. It's a process that's connected. And they'll come to Brisbane, or like lockdown in Melbourne, the quality of life in Melbourne got terrible. 30,000 people ended up on the Gold Coast. So yeah, that would happen a lot less. And I think, is that a desirable outcome? Probably. I think politically, people feeling like they don't have to move out of the city where they grew up because of the price of housing. Yeah, probably. It's a good political outcome. But yeah, it's not that hard to tighten up visas, right? We closed the borders during COVID and everyone loved it. And I was one of the few people saying, 0 is the wrong number as well as 500,000 in terms of migration. There is a sweet spot where everyone's free to move, but we're not just sort of juicing the stats, so to speak. On students, you can do a cap and trade. You can make universities bid for a fixed quota of international students per year and set that in relation to the population. And they might, you'd raise a lot of money. You can require universities to house the foreign students outside of the market, or in, rather than them just going renting places, but require them to house people. In foreign workers, it's very easy to just raise the minimum wage that lets you qualify for these types of visas. It's really not hard, and it's not rocket science. It's just that, again, it's a situation where there's a lot of interest groups. In the university sector, they love saying we're Australia's third biggest export, this and that, right? And I have an article on Fresh Economic Thinking, just diving into that tiny statistical assumption hidden away. And I confirmed with the ABS that, yeah, education counts as exports, despite the fact that the majority of foreign students work here and live here for more than 12 months out of 16 months, because they just assume that it's an export. That's it. They go, yeah, if they were on a work holiday visa, that wouldn't be an export. They'd actually be working and living here. But even if they're working the same amount, if they're enrolled in university or some kind of teaching institute, we're just going to assume that that's an export. And now you guys get to just create this number and say anything your foreign students spend money on while they're here is an export, even if they're just spending what they earn driving Uber or whatever else. It's just this bizarre situation. And yet it's just an untouchable part of the mainstream discourse now. It's one of those bizarre things. Another puzzle for the astute listener.
Right. Well, sure. Let's go on to another puzzle for the astute listener, which relates to building and construction and approvals and all those things, right? So there's a really interesting observation in your book, which says, well, if you look at it carefully, you probably can't build many more than we currently build. They'll just be built differently in different locations, depending on a whole bunch of different assumptions around planning and regulation, all those sorts of things. Now, I think that's a really important observation, not least because, of course, there was some recent data published that showed the new starts are actually going down. It's taking longer to complete, particularly, of course, because a high-rise takes longer to build because it's just more complex. And so the total number of new properties coming into the system is projected to continue to drop over the next few years. So this whole question of planning, supply, all of those things,
Hmm.
which again is another of those hot potatoes that a lot of people are saying, oh, just change the
Yeah.
planning rules,
Yeah.
go high rise all the way up the railway corridors, and that'll solve everything. But again, it's way more complicated, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if it's more compli yeah, I've okay, you're right. It is more complicated because I've tried to explain this many times and I'll try again now. That density, the number of dwellings per land area on a site, is not the same as supply, which is the number of new dwellings per period of time across every potential site in a region. All right. So you can have a supply of 100,000 dwellings a year. You can supply 100,000 detached homes, or you can supply 100,000 high rises, or some combination, right? The density doesn't determine how quickly all of that happens. What determines how quickly? Well, there's a market equilibrium called the absorption rate equilibrium. What that means in normal language is that property owners don't want to undercut their profits today or their profits tomorrow by building too fast today. And so there's this trade-off between building faster today or taking that last dwelling and delaying it and building it next year, right? Because the faster I go, the lower prices, because supply and demand work. We just confuse supply and demand as density and demand for some reason. But supply and demand means that, yeah, if you want to sell your new development faster, you're going to have to accept a lower price. Therefore, in every market condition, there is a limit, a speed limit on how quickly you should build to maximize the present value of that sequence of sales out of a project. And that's why almost every decent sized housing project is staged over many years, right? Because if you try to sell it all at once, imagine just trying to sell 100 dwellings on a weekend because you've got 100 to sell. Why would you wait? Just have an auction, sell 100. Well, you're going to exhaust the market pretty quickly, and those last 50 are going to have to be sold at a discount. The alternative to that is to sell steadily and slowly and, respond to demand. Oh, everyone's showing up to buy. Okay, I'll put the price up and I'll sell quicker. Oh, everyone's going, put the price down, but I'll sell slower. That's pretty much what you do. And I had the experience working in FKP. I was a sort of assistant development manager, just graduated, and the sales office we closed down because there was a queue around the block for this off-the-plan apartment at the Sunshine Coast. And we'd set the prices not that long ago, but the market was moving so quickly, we decided, oh, rather than sell them all today, which we could, why don't we close the sales office, change the prices, and open it again next weekend? And instead of selling them all on Saturday morning, we sold them all over 4 years, right? Because we pre-sold, we got enough, started building, kept selling during construction, and then even a year after construction, we're still trying to sell a few of the apartments. So, I mean, that's a real life example of this, but it applies all across the market. And that's why, we saw this price booms in apartments in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane during the 2010s, and we had a construction boom. And then people stopped buying, and so we stopped building. Now, it wasn't the planning system that made people stop building, and it's not the planning system today, as you know, that's stopping people building. It's constraints, either market constraints, whether that's buyers, not enough buyers, or builders, not enough builders. And we've sold these and we're just delaying the construction period because we've got the contract and we're just going to time when we commit to construction to make it more profitable. Because if we commit now, we have to pay a premium, so we make less money. But if we can delay it and start next year, and I know plenty of developers in Brisbane who've got, decent projects with decent pre-sales who've either temporarily or permanently delayed projects, right? Because the construction market's not, the speed limit of the construction market has been reached. So yeah, if we could just upzone, if it really was the planning system that decided how many homes there were, not where different types of dwellings go, then I'd be saying we just upzone, flood the market, prices would crash, we're solved. And some people think that, which is why there's such a passionate debate. But look around the world, the housing market everywhere in the world is responding to the same macroeconomic conditions as Australia, with all sorts of different planning schemes. And lack of planning schemes. The Texan cities in the United States, which used to be the utopia of free planning, have seen faster rental increases than San Francisco in the last 5 years. and many other notoriously bad planning cities. Now, yeah, they're having a construction boom too, because prices and construction go together in the cycle. When everyone wants to buy, you want to build and you want to sell together. When they stop, you'll stop. So that's the story, and that's part of the book. Again, the absorption rate equilibrium is explained with lots of examples, and it really it helps tighten your thinking on these topics, right? I briefed Treasury last week in Canberra about housing, and we discussed, how do you get the market to supply fast? And I said, well, you have to participate in it, right? You can't just trick property owners to build faster when it's not in their interest. Why don't you just go and buy homes off the plan? Mystery shopper from Treasury, big checkbook, just go and buy at a discount. Yeah, I'll take half of these, but I want 15% off because there's no commissions or anything. And I can give you good payment terms, and then they'll build in response to that demand, just like they would in response to anyone else who showed up to buy them. So anyway, yeah, you're right. I'm really surprised at how hot the NIMBY-YIMBY debate has gone, when if we look at what's happening out there, it's not the town planners deciding to stop building homes right now or stopping them, right? This has been going, complaining neighbors have been around for 40, 50 years, right? It's the market, unfortunately. And that's why, as we said at the beginning, we're in that normal, predictable part of the market cycle where interest rates and prices both rise together at the end of the cycle. And what happens? Construction really thins out or slows down. And then it's like this Wile E. Coyote situation. Who gives first? Do people sell out, or does it keep going? Yeah, that's the situation we're in, I think.
Yes, and it's worth, I think, highlighting the fact that we've got builders who are struggling with the ability to be able to build because, of course, the economics of building are actually all over the place. They can't get the workers, or they have to pay a lot if they do. The materials costs are a lot higher. And you've still got very big penalties that are involved with the building process, approval fees and those sorts of things. So there's a whole bunch of economic questions which are sort of lost in there. But you've also then got land banking, which is where they say, well, actually, I'm going to be able to get more tomorrow rather than today. And I suspect, I don't know what you think, but I suspect the land banking philosophy is probably even more powerful than the short-term economic issues around the way that builders are functioning at the moment.
Yeah, so let me pick up on a couple of your points there. I think firstly, you're right that you're sort of saying, getting to the point where the macroeconomy and the housing market are sort of intricately linked. And I think we miss that. All too often we think what's happening today is because some political decision happened today, therefore this. We really give a lot of, we imagine in our mind that politicians are very powerful and planners are very, very powerful, right? And so if things go down, it was because of you guys. It can't be a market outcome, but I think that's true. Housing and the macroeconomy are very tight. Your point about the land banking, I guess this is the way I try to describe it, is we don't really actually have a good theory of housing supply, right? But we know when demand rises, prices rise, and construction go up together, typically. It's not the fact that, we build a lot and prices go down. That just never happens. Usually they go together. And land banking is just like the inverse of supply, right? So developed sites that aren't developed, by definition, are land banked, right? Now you might say, oh yeah, but it's more profitable this way. And oh yeah, of course, that's the market outcome. Yes, everybody's stretched and they're like, oh, should I delay? Oh, is it profitable? Yes, that's right. But land banking is the inverse. So the one way to describe it is supply starts when speculation ends, right? When the returns from waiting are lower than the returns from building, then you build. When they're not, you don't. And across the market altogether, these returns equalize so that everybody's undeveloped sites rises in value at the same rate as the total return on those that have been built on. And that's where we get to this equilibrium point. But yeah, I think it's a mistake to call land banking, though, a behavioral issue or something abnormal to the market, whereas it is the market. This is how property markets adjust. And there's nothing unusual with it. We need land banks because that's where houses come from, right? Undeveloped sites it's just the ones that aren't built today are held. And there's no physical barrier to them being built. There's no regulatory barrier. There's just a market constraint in that if you try and build them all at once, you'll make less money than if you try not to build them all at once. So I think that's something we miss. We really overlook it, and we concentrate too much on the microeconomics and miss these trends.
Well, that's why I started with the idea of looking over the last 20 years rather than the last 6 months, right? Because there are some long-term mega trends that actually are playing out. And as I said at the start, no surprise then that we get what we get, because the markets are the markets and they're behaving like markets when they actually look at the way things go. But let me talk about markets in the rental sector, because of course one of the other issues that has been very much to the fore has been the costs of rent. They've risen significantly. But you actually made an interesting point that if you look at the long-term trends, compare it with incomes, it's a bit of a different story.
Yeah, so there's a couple of tricks with rents. We talk about the rent to income ratio a lot, but quite often we're not measuring the incomes of renters and the rents paid by renters. We're measuring the incomes in a neighborhood and the rents paid by some renters. So all those incomes of those age pensioners, the age pension's 26 to 40,000, depending if you're a single or a couple, are being put into the average income, whereas you might have very dual income young renters, right, paying 20% of their income, and then your statistic is a bit messed up. So if you actually look at the statistics where you take renters' incomes and rents paid by those renters and look at the rent to income ratio, you'll find that it was 20% in 2021. And so the Survey of Income and Housing comes out, it came out every second year for a while, but essentially every fifth year. And in 2021, it was 20%. Now, there's a huge distribution around that figure. If you follow me on Twitter at Dr. Cameron Murray, go to the media, you'll see a scatter plot, which is like a dot plot that looks like a banana shape. And that's the survey data from 8,000 data points of the income and the rent income ratio of those households. I've put the mean and the median on there. And actually, if you look at that survey back in time, the median was 20% in 2016 and 20% in 2011 and 20% in 2006 and 20% in 2001 and 20% in 1991. And so that's pretty unusual. And if we go to New Zealand and we look at the similar surveys, rent to income ratios are essentially flat for 40 years. If we go to Canada and do it, we get the same number. If we go to the UK, we get flat lines. And so the question here is, why all these flat lines? I thought rents were getting expensive. And then it makes us think about market outcomes and not individual outcomes. It's true that many people's rents are going up, but they're going up because someone else is trying to rent in that area with a higher income and is willing to pay more. And so the rental issue we're seeing post-COVID in Australia and abroad is the same rental issue that Henry George wrote about in 1879 in Progress and Poverty. He says, why is it that during economic booms, we get all this apparent poverty and homelessness? Well, that's because economic booms, one of the characteristics of those are that rents don't rise evenly. And so incomes don't rise evenly. And so if other people's incomes are rising in your town, your neighborhood, and yours are not, the consequence of that uneven rise in income is people get forced to relocate when they don't want to. And that's the best way to describe what's happened. And at the same time, this adjustment has involved a big nominal change in rents because of the cumulative 18% or so, inflation over the last 2.5 years. And so just to keep up with inflation, rents had to rise 18%, to keep up with incomes a little bit more, and to counteract the abnormal decline in rents during COVID and before. Rents fell, remember, from 2017, 18, and 19, and then for 2 more years. So that in many places, people during COVID in the cities were paying the same rent as 10 years ago, nominally. So there's a huge rapid change after that. And that is what you'd expect the market to do once the economy's growing and everyone can relocate and spend their incomes and there's no COVID constraints anymore. And that's what's happened in Australia and it's what's happened globally. And it's very, very disruptive to renters, right? And it's not, so again, it's not that the market's doing something abnormal. It's just when this rapid nominal adjustment happens during a period of growth, when incomes are rising unevenly, this is a side effect of that process. And yeah, so I think it's totally reasonable that there's a lot of attention paid to the renters at the moment. And you know, the quick and direct way to resolve that is to regulate the pace at which rents can increase. And so the typical European model is that CPI plus 3% is the maximum you can increase rents in a given year. So you can increase rents once a year and there's a maximum rate. And it's linked to the broader macroeconomic conditions. And so what you would see instead of what's happened in some CBD areas or some blue chip inner suburbs of the capital cities where rents have gone from say 500 to 700 in 1 or 2 years, so 20% a year for 2 years, those growth rates would have had to be spread out over many more years. So you'd get CPI plus 3%. So you might get to be able to put your rent up 10% this year and 8% next year and 9% the following year. And so those tenants would see that smoothed out rather than just in 1 year or 2 years. So yeah, these are definitely a useful thing. And if the interesting thing about rents is this 20% of income equilibrium, it's also a minimum as well as a maximum, if you catch my drift. It's a market outcome, right? So if rents, for some reason, were 10% of people's incomes, right? If we announce tomorrow, guys, you have to halve all your rents for the next 6 months. Okay, great. Oh, now you can set rents whatever you want again, right? They would immediately go back up to where they were. Right? How do we, and the question is why, right? Because we'll just set rents at 10% of income. Why can they put them back up? Well, they know that 6 months ago, people were willing to pay that. And if you can kick me out, someone else would be willing to come in and get it. And so to keep rents below this amount, you need to prohibit trades in rents. And the only example I could find, I'm sure there are others, but the only example I could find where rents stayed much below those equilibrium numbers is with rent control after the Second World War. And in Vienna, after the First World War, what was really interesting is they set rent controls at the price pre-World War One. But because that rent was only 5% of people's nominal incomes, they couldn't let people sublet and they couldn't let people move and trade because the retail price would rise up to 20% of income. So they had a central clearinghouse where if you had extra kids and needed a bigger place, you'd have to nominate your place and you'd have to be matched with someone else and you'd get to swap, occupying yours for theirs, or these indirect triads and trades, because you couldn't let people freely bargain over these locations or they'd bid up rents to 20% of their income again. And so it wouldn't be effective. So I do feel like that's a powerful insight because we often think, oh yeah, remember upzone, all this will happen, rents will fall, they'll go down by half. But how will they stay there? And how will you stop people trying to move to better places or bigger houses with fewer people and spend more of their income on that? It's not clear to me that that's possible. And so we have to sort of accept that that's the equilibrium outcome, but we've got to acknowledge that markets adjust. They have a cycle. And so some parts of the cycle are very, very disruptive, and we can actually smooth that off. And one good justification, I think, to argue that this is fair is that in New South Wales and Queensland, landlords get their land tax smoothed out and averaged over time as well, because instead of taking your last year's land value, they take the average of the 3 prior years. So if in 1 year your land value doubles, you don't pay double land tax. You pay 30% extra this year, and then another 30% extra next year, and then another 30% extra. And we smooth that change out over 3 years. So I think if it's fair enough to smooth out sudden shocks to cash flows for landlords, it's probably fair enough for tenants too. And these regulations wouldn't bind most of the time. All through the 2010s, most of the time it wouldn't have had any effect. And when rents were falling, it has no effect. In fact, you can catch up to the market. When the market rent's falling and your tenant's below market, you could catch up. But during these periods that are very disruptive, it would bind, and it would, help renters adjust. So anyway, I think that's, rental market right now, got to understand what's happening here and globally, and think about ways, well, if you want to smooth that out for tenants, that's the most direct way to do it.
A couple of observations, and the chat got quite agitated with some of the things that you were saying, which is quite acceptable.
Oh, really?
And we throw a couple of comments out. But just in terms of that 20%, is that gross income or is that net available?
That's actually after tax.
Right.
Yeah, it's disposable total household. So it's not a single wage earner, and it's all income sources. So that's salaries, profits, welfare payments, family tax, you name it.
Yeah.
It's the pooled disposable income of the whole household.
And so this is quite a good way into it. So Edwin, and hi Edwin, nice to see you on Tuesday rather than Monday. Edwin is one of my regulars. As a property investor, rent control your investment properties, is it fair and a good idea? And I guess that's the contention, isn't it? You've always got the renter and then you've got the investor. And a lot of investors, of course, traditionally have been mum and dad investors, although we're actually seeing a little bit more now of corporates moving into the rental sector and providing a commercial model which looks to actually be lifting rents. So I always sort of struggle with this two-face, right? Because you've got renters on one hand, you've got the property investors on the other hand, and you're trying to square a circle. And I think my own perspective would be that the government has stepped back from the rental sector compared with 20 or 30 years ago. So they've outsourced the rental sector to the private sector, in other words, to the market. So once again, we've got the markets at the center of this.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that, Martin. And that's why when all the listeners buy the book, they'll get to the end and go, hey, let's not try and orchestrate a price crash in the private market. We can do some minor tweaks like regulating how quickly rents change and, a few other things, but mostly that's going to be how it is. If we want a different outcome, we can do it directly with public home ownership, public rentals, etc. Like we do for schools, like we do for roads, like we do for hospitals, like we do for libraries. It's not rocket science. Parks, we do it all. So the question is about, is it fair? Yeah, I was a landlord. One time, the maximum I had was three homes in a block of land. Bit of land banking there too. And I didn't really increase the rents on tenants. So my view as a landlord was that the stability of a good tenant was worth quite a lot, actually, in terms of weekly rent. And so my first tenant, he stayed at the house for 10 years nearly. I basically didn't put the rent up on him, and he'd saved up and bought his own house. And then when he moved out, I painted it, changed the carpets, fixed spruced it up, more than doubled the rent afterwards, right? So he was miles below market. But I remember talking to him and being like, oh yeah, your rent's far from market. But I just couldn't come up with a reason why that should go up. Because the only reason why is because I had what you'd call market power, right? And I think, you got to understand putting your money at risk buying a house is a risky investment. And one risk is policy change. That's true whether you buy Apple shares and the Europeans clamp down on, opening access to the App Store or whatever, or whether it's true whether you buy anything else. And so you have to, incorporate this. It's not a free lunch, right? Buying property. And remember, this is a very, if you zoom out and think about your cash flow sequence over a long period of time owning property, you can add up what the value of this is for a representative sort of home in a suburb. It's only going to bind for a few years, right? It might be $50 a week for a year, 1 year out of 10, and it might be $30 a week for 1 year out of 10, and it might be $20 a week for 1 year out of 10, right? So in terms of the present value of the cash flow, it's not very good, but you also just get stability as well, right? Because kicking a tenant out to raise the rent is one risk of raising rents. The tenant, you might keep the tenant and they'll pay, but you might also then have some vacancy, pay a commission to the real estate agent, get a crappy tenant the next time. So that's a risk as well. So I think it's reasonable. But okay, that's a good question, Edwin. Okay, I wrote about this the other day. That it doesn't matter for the market who owns the homes. And if a landlord sells, they either sell to another landlord or to a non-homeowner, in which case that's an extra first home buyer, right? Now, if we actually want more home ownership, the only way to get there is for them to buy some of the 3.5 million homes owned by the current landlords, right? There's no other way to get higher home ownership except for landlords to sell to homeowners. And in fact, after the Second World War, this sort of mid-century golden age for housing, we had very strict rent controls. And one of the established effects of that was that landlords couldn't make a good return in housing. So they sold them to buy other assets in the economy. And that exodus of landlord contributed to boosting home ownership after the Second World War, right? So yeah, there's definitely, I'm totally fine if investors want to sell. I mean, property goes up and it goes down, right? Rents go up and they go down. That's fine. That's a risk. Do you know what's also a risk? Land taxes going up or down, right? No one would complain if land taxes went down, right? Right. So this is just the flip side of that investment risk. And I was a landlord. It's not like I don't understand it, or I just honestly, I made heaps of money in property. It's very, I guess I was very aware, I think, as a landlord that I had low expectations. I didn't expect to just make money. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect that. I realized, oh, actually, this is kind of like a job. I actually have to look after the tenants. They're my customers. And that's why I liked keeping good tenants and not putting the rent up. So, if we have more landlords with that approach, I'm totally fine. And if we have more first home buyers, I think that's reasonable as well. I mean, do we want? Well, I mean, think about it, right? Okay, that's great. Let's have more landlords, fewer homeowners, and less regulation of rents. Well, okay, aren't we going to be here in 10 years having an even bigger discussion about how there's 45% of households are private renters and their rents are rising rapidly and they have been forced to move everywhere? Well, that sounds bad. That sounds like pre-war Australia, right? Where we did have a majority of households rent and literally we had slums. People couldn't even keep food in their house. It was like very, very bad housing conditions, right? Question, I think what's happening in Melbourne is good for the average person property prices. There was another one, I think, from Edwin. What's happening in Melbourne? I don't know. I was just in Melbourne, seemed fine. Who's not buying it in Melbourne? Every seller has a buyer.
Yeah. So in Melbourne, what we're seeing is a lot of property listings, and a lot of those property listings are actually from ex-investors. And one of the reasons why a lot of investors in Melbourne are actually putting their property on the market is because the returns they're now getting are considerably lower. And of course, the Victorian government has increased a whole bunch of rules and regulations and taxes and things. So effectively, the economics for a lot of investors in Melbourne have actually been shot to pieces. And Queensland's actually quite similar now. So we're seeing similar trends beginning to break out there too. So another example of government intervention or market intervention, depending on how you look at it, I guess.
Look, the data on, I mean, first home buyers slightly elevated. I'm fine with that. Like the housing market is not there to guarantee returns for investors. Surely that's like a fundamental step one. If you want to do something about housing, you don't want to devote more of renter households' consumption basket to the incomes of landlords. Like that seems to me, step one. Maybe step two is you want to provide more security for more households. Now, You can do that by giving all renters directly security through tenant rights, or you can make more households homeowners, right, where they have a very good relationship with their landlord. And yeah, if they can both work together, right? If you regulate rents and landlords sell, well, the tenants who stay tenants have better conditions. Pardon me. And the landlords who sell offer up a home for a buyer. Now, maybe another landlord buys, and that's fine. Well, it turns out there's lots of landlords willing to participate in that market. That's fine too. Just going to have a drink when I find my...
Sure. Okay. No worries. Let you get yourself sorted out. And yeah, I'll just make a couple of points because my data is showing significant pressure on the number of renters. In fact, I measure is a particular way, which is effectively disposable income. And then I look at the other outgoings. And so a lot of renters are really struggling with the ability to be able to pay those rents and live. And by the way, the taxes are a lot higher and the inflation costs are a lot higher, et cetera, et cetera. So net, I've never seen such a high proportion of difficulty. Now, that isn't just because of rents. It is because of the other factors in the market, particularly around inflation. I've also
inflation
seen
of other consumer goods.
Yeah. So you've got to look holistically at all of the other demands on those household incomes. Now, people are actually working multiple jobs, working more hours to try and actually square the circle, but it's a big pressure, and I regularly make shows on this. Interestingly, also, if you look at the property investors, I've done quite a lot of work looking at the net investment yields rather than gross investment yields, because the net investment yields is after all the costs of the property, things like maintenance and those sorts of things. And I've seen very significant drops in the net investment yield, particularly in Victoria. And if you then actually think about a property investor being first an investor and secondly choosing to invest in property, if they can actually see a better return by investing in, I don't know, term deposits or the equity markets, then perhaps that's another reason why more investors are saying, well, actually, it's not worth a candle. The government interventions and the other pressures have actually made it difficult. So you've got a really interesting contention. Then, of course, you've also got the other factor in all of this, which is that there's still some talk about removing negative gearing, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a level of uncertainty in the minds of some investors too. So all of these other sort of flows of issues, of all the various torrents and streams are actually also creating considerable confusion in the minds of many investors at the moment. So maybe that's part of the reason why we're seeing a bit of a change in the supply and demand. And I like the point you made. Well, every investor who sells, that's a property that a first-time buyer could buy, but only if they can get the loan to do it. And of course, the lending standards are relatively tight, and the debt income multiples are lower than they were because of the high interest rates. So many first-time buyers aren't able to step in, even if some of the international purchases are.
So yeah, I'm just looking at the ABS lending finance data, and it looks like investor lending's holding up much better than owner-occupied lending. So it's not clear to me that shows a sort of net exodus of investors. I've got here year-on-year percentage change, 18% for investors and 3% for owner-occupiers up to January this year, even though it looks like there's been a sharp decline in the second half of last year, ex-refinancing. So yeah, some investors, sure, they're selling. I mean, I think it's a great time to sell if you've just capitalized on the COVID era price gains, cash them in and just get out, right? If the yields are low again, you've made most of your gains you're going to make for the next 10 or 15 years during this 3-year period. So I think it's totally reasonable to do it. If you don't like paying the taxes, don't let someone else do it. Take your money. There's plenty of things to invest in. That's part of the market, places, right?
Yeah. So, that's part of the market philosophy, isn't it? You're free to choose whatever you want to invest in, and
that's right. Yeah, I think that's
in a way the tax system tries to actually equalize returns irrespective of the mode of investment that you go with, although sometimes more than others, I think. Now, here's an interesting question, and it's actually one which I come back to, which Jet Black says, is housing a human right? I think this is a really interesting question, right? So we've spoken about the fact that there's a market dynamic going on all the time, right? Supply,
Hmm.
demand, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how does supply demand markets map onto a human right for housing or not?
Mm.
And I've got this view, I've had it for some time, that the problem we seem to have gone is almost swung to let the market almost dictate what's going on. Is there a place
Yeah.
for government intervention, particularly to ensure
Yeah.
that the human rights are actually protected and that housing is something which people are going to get access to at a reasonable price?
Yeah. So I'm going to try and remember three things. One, food, Singapore, homelessness, and housemate. So if you can remind me, Martin, if I forget. Firstly,
Yep.
food, right? Food seems like a real important right. Yeah, we all should have a right to food. Uh, but what we do for that is we give people money. And money works really well because food is highly mobile. We can actually ship it around, right? Doesn't matter where you work, where your family is. You can drive, get a truck, get a train, food arrives. Housing's a little bit different because everyone could get a house, I think, somewhere. You can always go and park a caravan out in the sticks and live there. But a caravan out in the sticks and a caravan on Bondi Beach are very, very different, right? So it's not the house that it's sort of a universal right to a accessible location. Is that a universal right? Because we can't separate the home from the location were that you need to function in society, right? And so I think, yeah, we need to acknowledge that what we're talking about here is a right to land, a universal right to live somewhere reasonably accessible without having to pay someone else. Um, and so I do think that's a good way of thinking about it, but I don't think it tells us in practice what to do. Because in food, we just give people money, right? For schools, we subsidize them, but we also build them. For healthcare, we also pool our resources and insure publicly and privately, but we also directly provide. So we sort of do what works in different sort of key parts of what we need for a good life. And so housing, that location thing is really important. And so now I'm going to skip ahead to Singapore. And I was listening to a podcast, an American housing research podcast, and they were interviewing an official from the Housing Development Board of Singapore. And they're from California, these podcasters. And they said to him, so how much homelessness is in there in Singapore? Our estimates here is like 1 million people in California, how much in Singapore? And he goes, oh, zero? And they're like, oh, what do you mean? It's like, well, maybe someone might be asleep, but they've got somewhere to live. They're just having a nap because it's hot. They're under. And they're like, what? How do you know it's zero? And he said, well, because we just give everyone who doesn't have a house a place to stay. That's the policy. If you employ a foreign worker, you're obliged to house them. If you're a resident and you don't have a place, we'll give it to you. And everyone over 21 can qualify to buy from the Housing Development Board and also rent very cheaply if they want as well. And they'll just soak up everybody, right? And I thought that was amazing because we don't sort of see it like that here. I suspect that's due to our history of having lots of land and people just going west and, finding somewhere to make a life for themselves and finding that this land's cheap. But I think, it's 2024. In a modern economy, we need a lot of people in cities. And so the question is, how do we provide universal access to be able to live in a city? Because, are we just going to are we going to accommodate this geographic difference by paying teachers who work in the city 3 times more than teachers in a regional town? There are many fairness issues that come up, I think, when trying to just let the market solve the city inequality problem. And so that's why I propose in the book, we take a cue from Singapore and we do just like we built public schools all around the city and all around the country, offer similar public housing options, universal, so not just for the poorest people, and for purchase at a discount So typically it'll be half the market price, and buy or build these types of projects mixed in around all the suburbs of the city, so that anyone in that rental market who's just faced their rents going up from 500 to 700 and considering moving towns or something because of this, they can go, oh, I've got this other option. I can buy into that. So, if people can't afford the private health insurance, well, if they have a heart attack, they'll get looked after. Okay, we can take the same approach to housing too. And Singapore did it. They took their home ownership rate from 20% in 1965 when the HDB started after independence to 88% at the end of the 1980s, because they just built everyone a home and you could buy it at a discount. And currently you can go and buy from the Housing Development Board a 5-bedroom executive suite or a 1-bedroom studio, and typically half to a third of the market price, even though there's a the market there is essentially dominated by international buyers and expats and things. And you could do the same here. And just like it would be fine to go to public school in a middle ring Sydney suburb, maybe it's fine to own a small townhouse from the public housing provider because your work, it's very convenient, and you can always sell it and buy a private home later. And so I think, that is the most direct way, because I think the political dilemma is this. We keep thinking we're going to manipulate the private market to give us this cheap houses for everyone. And the market is how it is. There are cheap houses for everyone. They're just really far away. That's why they're cheap. No one wants them. Good locations are scarce, therefore we bid them up. And I think if we want to overcome that, we need to intervene and say, hey, if this is sort of the price curve, in this middle here, we're going to offer some alternatives in the suburbs and regional towns. I think it's workable. I think it's workable because it's been done before and it's very, very functional. It's going to be hard to start, but over time, what you'd see is we've got 67% of people homeowners, 30-something% private renters. Over time, what you'd see is you build up to about 10 or 15% of the market being this public schools of housing around the suburbs. And the renters that are left will be left because they're very mobile, they're working for big international companies, whatever, but they'll know that they have the option to switch out if they want that secure housing, and own their own home at that discount. The cost of it is not particularly large. Singapore is about a 20 billion subsidy per year for 20,000 homes. But the comparison you have to understand is it's 20,000 homes times times 99 years worth of discounted housing. So if we can compare to like subsidizing rental, we go, oh, it's 5,000 or a million, subsidized rents. Well, actually, that's a million subsidized rent for 1 year. This is 50% subsidized for 99 years per dwelling, right? So in comparison, I think it gives you a really good outcome. I think culturally it fits more, owning your own home. You can renovate, paint, not renovate, do whatever you want. And I think it fits with our public school, public hospital, parallel sort of options that we have elsewhere in the economy that seem to function quite well. And no one's required to do it either. And so there's this whole thing of, should we intervene in the market? Well, people get upset. Even the rent controls I was talking about, right? People get concerned about that. So maybe we just leave the market as much as we can, focus on creating an alternative. So that's where I end up. And this is the reality. There's no silver bullet, right? This thing would take years. It would take more than a decade. It would be very difficult. I look at a lot of archive records, but in our first war service homes after the First World War, we're a bit of a schmozzle, right? We had governors overpaying for land from their relatives and then employing other relatives to build houses who'd never built houses before. And, we've got to watch out for that. But I think we can do it. It just takes a little bit of practice. And then once you're entrenched the system, it's like public roads. People don't even think about it. But it's really, really hard and complicated to maintain a whole system of public roads. But we get good at it. We have the right machines, the right people, and it just plods along in the background.
So I guess the question here is, of course, that would swing in 20 to 30 years of neoliberal thinking, which says, let the markets just sort this out, right? We don't want to intervene. We don't want to, you know, stop the markets from being the markets. And yet, if you look today, the governments are spending a lot of money on rent assistance. They're spending a lot of money on negative gearing support and other things. And in fact, I saw a statistic quite recently that showed huge amount of money being spent on an ongoing basis to actually support this free market situation that we're in, right? So this could be a redirection of some of those funds to a completely different intent. And I'd also make the other point, and the question is, how does this fit between the state and the federal responsibilities? Because I would argue one of the other critical problems we have at the moment is everybody can say, it's not my problem. The feds can say, it's a supply problem. States, that's your problem. The states can say, well, okay, but it's not really ours. You can give us some money to try and build, but we can't actually get the workers because we can't get the migrants coming in with skills to be able to build. So it's like everybody says it's not my problem. So how do you get the state and the federal piece of the puzzle linked around this? Because it seems to me that this would be a huge move from where we currently are thinking the center of gravity is.
Yeah, you're right, Martin. Philosophically, no one wants this. State governments don't even really want to do the public housing they're currently doing. And I guess there's competency issues and incentive issues as well. What we did post-war is we had the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, so essentially federal funding on offer for the states to build homes for people, and then Commonwealth direction about methods at which tenants can purchase or rent to buy those properties. So it's definitely financially very possible for the federal government to do it, but I don't think it's that impossible for the states either. It's just a prioritizing thing. I often tell people, if you're talking about how to pay for something, you've lost the political battle. Things we want to do, we don't talk about how to pay for them, right? We only talk about how to pay for things when we don't want to do them, because we will prioritize if we want to do them. We'll find the money and we'll prioritize. So I think that, as far as I can see from a bargaining perspective, like think about the Housing Affordability Future Fund, right? $10 billion fund. I think I'm the only person who's asked, where did the $10 billion come from to put in the fund? If we don't have $10 billion to build houses, we also don't have $10 billion to buy BHP shares and Apple shares and US treasuries. So it's just, there's a lot of treasury brain, I call it. Treasury brain is when you have a non-current asset and you think it's not worth zero because it doesn't get counted when you can't net it out and calculate net debt. But it's just an arbitrary accounting convention. It's not economics, right? We know that because everyone in Australia loves leveraging into non-current assets and buying houses because they're great investments. And we just don't see it like that. I wrote an article on Fresh Economic Thinking a week before last about defence housing being this great landlord for defence personnel and building lots of housing, public housing, but only if you're in the military, right? Other private-public partnerships. I wrote about Middle Eastern governments who love building houses in Australia through their sovereign wealth fund, right? We somehow miss in the debate that houses are assets. And so when the government does it, it's a huge cost. Where would we find the money, right? And then these same people go home and they get on the phone to the mortgage broker. Can I have $1 million to buy a house? Okay, is it a good investment or not, right? It can't just become a bad investment because of some accounting convention in the public budget. And so if we look at Land and Housing Corporation New South Wales, for example, the value of their housing stock in the public housing scheme went from 34 billion in 2012 to 52 billion in 2017. That's just the gains in asset values from owning houses in Sydney during the 2010s, right? And I say to politicians, that entity is like a kind of like a fund that owns houses for Australians, like a Housing Australia fund, right? But they don't get it. They're like, no, 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 we can't just build houses. That's a waste of money. But we can spend money on other assets for some reason. So I think that's the first mental block that we need to get over. It's like, yeah, it costs money to build houses, but now we have more assets, right? And we can share them around in any way we think is fair and reasonable. So yeah, on the budget side, look, we should have a good chance. Well, we should have. Uh, I don't know which side of politics would be more likely to take a big leap on housing. Um, but we've got what, Labor federal government and a Labor state government in Queensland, and it's Labor government in New South Wales as well, I think. Not much action. And is it still a Labor government in Victoria? Probably. If we had a chance to make a big difference, it would be now. But relatively modest changes are happening. And I suspect that's been the case every cycle, right? In the 2000s, we had all these inquiries, then we had the financial crisis, then we tried to make houses more expensive with low interest rates. And I suspect the interest in big, bold changes in housing will wane before, before the end of the cycle. And then our interest will go other ways. And we'll be like, oh, we've got to boost the housing market to stop the next recession. And we'll have the same situation again. So yeah, I'm a bit sort of disappointed that there hasn't been more discussion at this political opportune time, because rents are rising quickly, because there's Labor governments at state and federal levels who could make some changes. But then again, maybe that's good because I've got a book to sell. So I actually write in the last chapter. Oh yeah, if we fixed housing, what do I say? Something like my interests are also perverted by Australia's housing market, because if we fix it, no one will buy my book.
Oh dear. Yeah. Well, probably no one will watch my show on what the world
Exactly.
if indeed
Isn't
housing
it
was
funny?
fixed. But is it interesting? As we sort of come to the end of this conversation, that there are solutions out there potentially, but the real solutions are not the sort of the finger in the dike things that are going on at the moment. With minor tweaks to planning controls, et cetera, or incentives from federal government to try and get state governments to build a bit more. There has to be a grander vision and a bigger plan. But I have to say, a grander vision and a bigger plan seems to cut right against and across where most political parties are and where the political cycle takes us. So I suppose my conclusion is we're going to muddle on the way we're muddling on unless or until the whole thing blows up, or until we get a really visionary leader who can step out and step up and actually take us in a new direction, which isn't actually necessarily good news, right? We're just going to go
Comes with
around,
risks.
we're going to go
Yeah.
round and round and round through the washing machine a few more cycles.
I suspect you're right. I suspect you're right as well, Martin. As most political observers note, it takes a crisis to get change. So I think everyone wants to call it a crisis right now for their agendas. But the crisis is really that small share of renters exposed to that rising rents right now. It's been a great investment period for landlords and home buyers during COVID. And so we've got to think about, well, how do we address them without upsetting everyone else? And that's the political trade-off, I think, here. We don't want to upset we don't want to upset 18% of households who are landlords to get votes from only 10% of the renter households who benefit from it. And we don't want to upset the 67% of homeowners whose house might be their biggest asset by depressing house prices. So this is sort of why I think we muddle through. These are the political incentives. I think that's true. Visionary leader / crisis. Typically, it's a war or a new country becoming independent from a previous country, where you get radical, big changes that last generations in housing. I really wish it were, not the case, and that we could get it through the ballot box in a normal political cycle. But that was the conclusion I had to draw from doing my best research here and globally.
Last question from me. Superannuation. You've been quite vocal on the question of whether superannuation should be made accessible to first-time buyers
Mm,
to go buy houses. Just let's touch that before we close out, because I think
great.
that's a really important issue as well.
Okay. So, firstly, I actually think the best thing to do with superannuation is let people spend it on anything, not just houses, because the households that are in the least financial stress are home-owning age pensioners. And yet we have a system where we're taking money off young working families who are the most financial stressed when they're the most financially stressed, so they can have more money when they're going to be the least financially stressed. So it doesn't even do what it says on the box, this superannuation system. So I remember when my kids were little, getting parenting payments and welfare support and whatnot, one year and thinking, well, hang on a minute, do I have too much money and I need to save in super, or do I not have enough money to raise my kids? Which can't be both, right? Isn't it weird? Shouldn't I get the money now? Um, so that's my big picture point. The superannuation system's redundant and it makes everything about retirement more difficult for the people who need help and more easy for the people who don't need help. The age pension is age insurance. Like if I insure my car, I don't then start another savings account as well. It's redundant. It doesn't do anything. The car's insured. It's fine. So that's my big picture one. So secondly, super for housing. Well, super already gets used for housing, and I think that's a myth we need to yeah, the idea that super is this special insulated thing. It's not related to the housing market. It's this special magic retirement thing. We need to do away with that because self-managed super funds love to buy houses. And the biggest use of people at age 60 when they withdraw a lump sum is to buy a house, a bigger house, or pay off their mortgage. So super is already used to buy a house. It's just you've got to have a big loan during the younger years at the same time as having super, or have a self-managed fund and buy someone else's house, or have your fund buy a build to rent, which you can rent off your own fund, which makes no sense either. So super for housing, the big concern with doing it, I don't think it's going to make things more equal or radically change home ownership. It will bring forward a few home purchases and it might delay some others. And in terms of equality, I don't think it's a straight line making equality better or worse. It's just it's a bit of a nothing on that front. But the thing is, owning your own home is the best asset to have in retirement. Singapore's retirement, 3 pillars. So Australia's got 3 pillars of retirement: compulsory savings, age pension, and voluntary savings. Singapore has 3 pillars of retirement: a paid off home, free healthcare, and a income support stream. Paid off home was their first pillar of retirement because we know not having to pay housing costs during retirement saves you lots of money, gives you security, it insulates you from those rental price variations at different points in the cycle. So it's the best asset to own, but your superannuation account can't buy it. So why not use it? The big argument against it is that it will push up prices. Now, and people compare it to the first homeowners grants, but there's a difference. First homeowners, you've got two options. So economists think about these marginal shifts, right? In first homeowners grants, when I first bought a home, was $7,000. If you didn't buy a home, you got zero. And so you had a year or 2 years where you either got $7,000 if you bought a home, zero if you didn't, right? So you had a pretty strong incentive to get the 7,000, go and buy a home. If you could, you had a pretty strong incentive to bid up to the 7,000. Superannuation is not free money for the buyer because superannuation, yeah, maybe my purchasing power is higher today if I use my super. Do you know what? If I don't buy it today, it's even higher tomorrow because my super fund might grow over time and I can chuck more money, tax advantage money in it. And so actually, there's no sort of rush to the exits. There's a little bit of an adjustment the first year, right? But after that, there's no rush to the exits with super because everyone who doesn't buy can buy tomorrow and use it just like any other savings account. And so I think it's not going to have a sustained price effect. Yeah, certain areas you'll find people get out and buy houses. Look what happened during COVID. We had record first home buying, partly because people could take 20,000 out of their super, right? In 2 blocks during COVID. And we got 166,000 first home buyers in the financial year 2021 compared to about 90,000 per year in the 5 years prior. I think that's a good thing. Now, some people might be struggling with their mortgage right now, but they've had a few years of 2% mortgages. And that's, that was cheaper than renting in those years. And if they'd been savvy and pushed down that mortgage as best they can, then many are doing fine. So yeah, I guess my argument is not that this solves housing or that it's going to radically boost first home buying. It might have a temporary, it might bring forward a few first home buyers during an adjustment period. It's simply that it's fair and that super is very, very unfair. And any small shift into owning your own home in retirement is generally a good thing. And if super can already be used for buying other people's homes, I think it's totally reasonable. So that's where I've landed. And to be honest, that wasn't my view 10 years ago. I've had to think about this a lot and study the markets and understand, just dive into the details to get to that point. Because I guess unthinkingly, I would have just gone, oh, super, more money for houses, boost demand. Okay. And then you realize, well, super's already used for housing. If super's not compulsory, you'll have fewer self-managed funds out there trying to invest because they're got even more tax advantages for doing so. So the net effect's probably not very small, and it's probably helping the people you want to help in terms of retirement and owning home. So that's my view. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, very interesting. Thank you very much. Well, we've come to the end of the show. Just want to highlight again the Great Housing Hijack is the book. And available from all good bookshops, available online. I downloaded the e-version and enjoyed reading it. I have to say, Cameron, I think you did an amazing job in terms of the research and also the depth of the analysis. And even if people don't necessarily agree with your conclusions, the journey that you take people on, I think, are actually, well, it's worth reading. I recommend it absolutely. And so thank you very much for the book and also for coming on tonight. Really appreciated you're taking the time out from a very busy schedule to spend time with us. And hopefully you'll come back on the show down the track again, and we'll explore further. These big themes. And what I like about this conversation is we get into some of the big themes, right? This isn't just about nickeling and diming around the edge of the topic. This is right to the heart of the issue. So I want to say thank you very much and appreciate your time tonight.
No, thanks for having me. It's always great conversation with you, Martin. I love being able to have that time to dig into the details, and we're not going to agree on everything, and nor are the commentators. And I don't think anyone's going to agree with everything in the book either. But as you say, I hope there's some valuable insights for everyone, and I want to elevate the level of debate, and just like you do here on the show.
Well, I think the book will certainly do that, and I think there's a lot more deep debate that needs to happen. So thank you for catalyzing that. Thanks very much. I'm going to take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Cheers.
Thank you.
So there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Even if you don't necessarily agree with all the themes and variations, it helps to understand the real dynamics, and I think that's definitely worth your time to read the book and to think through some of those issues. And we'll continue to raise the issues on this channel, of course. Just before I go, I should make the point that the dogs are still here. They've been up and down a bit, but they're still ready for the next walk. So that'll be the next thing on my list. And next week, we'll have Damien Klassen on, and Damien's coming on to give us a market update with regard to the financial markets. So we look forward to that. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Thank you for all the super chats. Thanks for all the comments and questions and observations there. And I look forward to seeing you on the next live show next Tuesday, or indeed, you can check out our recorded shows every day of the week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.